My wife recently sent me a link to something that the LDS Church put out about polygamy. She was quite upset about it, but I thought, how bad can it be? It's not like they're teaching polygamy to children or anything. Oh dear. This is from the Church's Scripture Stories for Children, Doctrine and Covenant Stories. And we'll run through it together, not very in-depth since it follows the standard LDS narrative that I've discussed in many other videos. Let's get into it. While the prophet Joseph was studying the Bible, he read about prophets like Abraham and Moses, who had been married to more than one wife. Brace yourselves, because that's the closest thing to a factual statement we're going to see in this for quite a while. It almost passed muster, but it's debatable from the Bible whether Moses had more than one wife, and Abraham did not at the same time. Hagar was Sarah's slave. The text continues, Joseph wondered how the Lord felt about that, so he decided to ask the Lord. The only evidence that Joseph ever asked God about polygamy is Doctrine and Covenants 132, a document of questionable provenance, first seen publicly many years after Joseph's death. On the other hand, there is a plethora of evidence that Joseph knew that monogamy is God's law of marriage, and that polygamy is never acceptable. Joseph dictated the anti-polygamy Book of Mormon, particularly Jacob 2, which his brother Hiram cited as evidence against polygamy, and Joseph himself appears to have annotated with one wife in his own personal copy. Shout out to Jeremy Hoop. Check out his video on that. Joseph strengthened the language in the Old Testament, condemning David's polygamy, even as the church claims he was wondering if polygamy was right. Joseph repeatedly published the law of the church on marriage, condemning polygamy and reaffirming monogamy. He spoke publicly and privately denouncing polygamy. He gave his brother Hiram free rein to crusade against a secret polygamy cult growing in the church, which used Hiram's sealing to his deceased wife, with his living wife acting as proxy, as a prop to their claims. Joseph gave his full support to his wife Emma's campaign against polygamy. To look at the things that Joseph actually said and did, rather than what people decades later claimed he said and did, and then say that he wondered how the Lord felt about polygamy, is asinine. With this image, we find the standard LDS canard repeated, that God usually commands monogamy, but sometimes commands polygamy, or more specifically polygyny, multiple wives. Never mind that God never in all the scriptures commanded polygamy, with the sole apparent exception of when Brigham Young pulled Section 132 out of his desk drawer to take LDS polygamy public. This paragraph also makes the misleading claim that this was called plural marriage, even though that term did not originate until after Joseph's death. Terms for polygamy used by Joseph and Hiram include spiritual wifery, fornication, adultery, abomination, and, quote, that damned fool doctrine. The text continues, a few years later, the Lord told Joseph to marry other women. Where? When? Not even Doctrine and Covenants 132 explicitly says this. It is based on the recollections of powerful polygamist Mormons and their wives, who were trying to defend and justify their practice of polygamy decades after Joseph's death. We read, this commandment was also hard for Joseph's first wife Emma. Sometimes Emma helped Joseph decide who he should ask to marry him. Other times Emma did not want Joseph to marry other women. The truth is that Emma fought alongside Hiram and Joseph against the secret polygamy cult in Nauvoo, and maintained to her dying day that Joseph never had any wife but her. Sources to the contrary are quite simply gossip that is passed off as history. Joseph taught the 12 apostles about plural marriage. It was a hard commandment for them too. In the face of the enthusiasm with which the apostles practiced polygamy after Joseph was dead, you might think this is supposed to be satire, but no. Incidentally, some of you may be thinking, but surely they have sources for all this. What about the footnotes? I've dealt with the truly terrible evidence for Joseph's alleged polygamy in many other videos, but let's check it out. The source for this claim, such as it is the Church's pseudo-historical Saints books. Saints references a discourse given by one of the chief polygamy apologists, Heber Kimball, a discourse given 20 years after Joseph was dead. And if that wasn't enough, the icing on the cake is that when you click on that link, you find the record doesn't exist. In fairness, maybe it's a mistake in the link. But I really didn't feel like searching through the church's almost 2,000 documents about Heber Kimball to try to find this specific one. Really, shouldn't that be their job? Anyway, it continues. Brigham Young and his wife Mary Ann prayed a lot to the Lord about what to do. They learned that they should obey the commandment of plural marriage. I'm told that victim blaming is bad, so out of respect to Mary Ann, let's just move on. For many years, some of the saints were asked to be in plural marriages. People outside the church did not like plural marriage. They made laws against it. Some saints, including church leaders, were put in prison. But the Lord blessed the families who obeyed his commandments, even when it was hard. Of course, people inside the church did not like polygamy either, principally the women, although good men also suffered because good men don't want to see women hurt. But, turning to the legality, this makes it seem like people suddenly decided that marrying multiple women was bad because the heroic Mormon pioneers were doing it. The truth is that bigamy had been illegal in the United States long before this, although enforcement varied by state. It had always been illegal in Utah, since the Utah Territory Act of 1850 prohibited polygamy. Interestingly, the reference in Saints doesn't mention any blessings, only the hardships. In 1890, the Lord told Wilford Woodruff, the president of the church, that men should not marry more than one wife anymore. Actually, it seems that Woodruff did not say that God told him that. He certainly doesn't in his justifications that are included in Official Declaration 1. He does say that God showed him what would happen if they did not stop, and that God told him to write the manifesto. But that's not the same thing as, "Thus saith the Lord, only marry one wife," especially since the manifesto says that they're stopping because of the law of Congress, not the commandment of God. Additionally, the church continued to give a wink and a nod to new polygamous marriages until 1904, when the Reed-Smoot hearings brought renewed public scrutiny, fully 14 years after God allegedly told them to stop. The church's scripture story ends with the only statement in this farcical piece that is completely true. This is still the Lord's commandment today. A man should be married to only one wife. This is really all they needed to print, because all the rest is a pseudo-historical, faith-promoting legend, cobbled together from a garbled mishmash of recollections, gossip, and hearsay. But that brings up what is potentially a far more sinister issue. Why is the LDS Church teaching polygamy to children? When I was growing up in the church, polygamy wasn't discussed at all, let alone taught to children. The subtitle to the piece is "Faith to Obey a Law from the Lord, Even When It's Hard." But there's a multitude of stories from the early history of the church that illustrate that principle. Why choose to focus on polygamy? And you can be sure that it was a deliberate choice by the leaders of the church. I can think of two possible reasons. The first is that the efforts of people to uncover the truth about Joseph Smith and polygamy, people like Richard and Pamela Price, Rob Fotheringham, Jeremy Hoop, Michelle Stone, Whitney Horning, and others, are having an effect. So much so that the church feels they need to inoculate children with this faith-promoting pseudo-history so that they are less likely to believe the evidence that Joseph was a monogamist. The second reason is the possibility that the church is preparing to allow polygamy again, and this is to prep the younger generation to live it. Polygamy doesn't get very far unless people, especially females, acquiesce. And if that's the case, would things like this children's story be considered grooming? On the other hand, maybe I'm too cynical. Perhaps there's a perfectly innocent reason for this that I haven't thought of. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. And check out my other videos where I discuss the prickly problems of polygamy in deep detail. Thank you for watching to the end, and I'll see you in the next video.